Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time to the bitter winters of the North American frontier. Imagine it's the middle of the 1800s, and instead of your thermostat and a cozy duvet, you've got drafty walls, icy winds sneaking through every crack, and frost so thick on the inside of your window you could doodle your name into it. You probably won't survive this, but we'll give it a go. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love for you to drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're listening. It's always fascinating to see this little sleepy community stretch across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake in a log cabin. It's still dark, the kind of black that feels heavy, pressing down on the roof beams. The single window glimmers faintly because frost has crept across it in lace-like patterns. Beautiful, but reminding you just how cold the night has been. Your breath fogs in front of your face. You pull your quilt tighter, patches stitched from worn-out trousers, scraps of calico dresses, maybe even an old flour sack or two. The cabin creaks around you as the wood adjusts to the temperature, popping sharply like a gunshot, then settling again. That sound might scare a modern guest, but you've come to expect it. The family beside you stirs. Frontier cabins weren't spacious, no separate bedrooms, no privacy, just a single room where everyone huddled for warmth. Parents, children, even the occasional guest all stacked together like cordwood, hoping shared body heat would outlast the night. Some families even let chickens in at night, not exactly cozy, but a feathery clucking heater is still better than frostbite. Historians still argue whether this practice was more common among poorer families or simply those desperate enough to try anything. Either way, it certainly made morning smell interesting. The fire in the stove has long since gone out. Someone forgot to stoke it, or maybe there wasn't enough wood to risk keeping it alive all night. Firewood was precious. You never wanted to run out before the snow melted, so you brace yourself, slipping bare feet onto the cold floorboards. The shock shoots up your legs like lightning, and suddenly you're wide awake. One joke you can make in this moment: congratulations, you've just invented the frontier alarm clock. Frozen toes. You shuffle to the stove, teeth chattering, and prod at the ashes. A faint ember glows, stubbornly holding on. With luck and a bit of kindling, you can coax it back. Without luck, you'll be blowing on blackened coals like a desperate birthday wish until your face turns red. When it works though, flames lick upward, filling the cabin with the first hints of light and the smell of smoke. Smoke that will cling to your hair, your clothes, your bedding, and likely your soul until spring thaw. Frontier perfume, unisex, long-lasting, slightly suffocating. As the stove groans back to life, you glance around the cabin. The chinking between logs, the clay or moss stuffed into the cracks, has shrunk or fallen out in places, and the wind whistles through. Some nights you wake to find snow dusting the floorboards, as if the storm outside decided to join you inside. Frontier families stuffed rags, paper, even old corn husks into those gaps, anything to keep out the draft. You quickly learn that four walls and a roof does not always equal warm. The cold doesn't just freeze your body, it changes your habits. Families often went to bed as soon as the sun set, not because they wanted to, but because candles and oil were expensive. In the long winter months, you'd spend nearly half your life in bed, not in luxurious rest, but simply huddled, trying not to freeze. Scholars have even debated whether this constant half-hibernation influenced the peculiar sleep patterns reported in historical records. Two shorter sleep cycles, broken by a quiet, wakeful period in the middle of the night. Imagine lying awake in the pitch dark, whispering with your family or saying a prayer, while the wind howls outside. Not the worst lullaby, but not exactly Netflix either. Of course, you had to keep watch for more than the cold. Coyotes, wolves, and sometimes far worse noises scraped at the edge of hearing. The cracks in the walls let sound carry strangely. A branch creaking could sound like footsteps, and you, with no electricity, no neighbors within shouting distance, had plenty of time to imagine worst-case scenarios. One quirky tidbit: Some frontier folks swore they could hear the snow itself singing on the coldest nights. A high-pitched crystalline whistle when the air was so dry that your footsteps squeaked like rubbing glass. Maybe it was real science, maybe just sleepless imagination, but either way, it gave you something eerie to talk about over breakfast. By the time dawn finally breaks, you're not refreshed. You're sore from the hard mattress, chilled by drafts, and already dreading the chores waiting outside. But there's also a kind of pride. You've survived one more night. You pull on stiff boots, frozen solid, unless someone had the sense to keep them near the stove, and you take a deep breath of icy air that feels like knives in your lungs. The frontier wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It was often just about staying alive until morning. And somehow, despite the frostbite, the creaking wood, and the smell of smoky quilts, families endured. You step outside into the gray light of morning, and the cold greets you like an old enemy that knows exactly where to strike. The air seizes your lungs, your nostrils sting, and for a brief second, you wonder why anyone ever thought building a homestead here was a good idea. The cabin behind you smokes gently, promising warmth inside, but out here is where the day really begins. Frontier mornings did not allow for snooze buttons, unless you count a rooster sitting on your chest as a snooze button, in which case you're welcome. First task, water. You trudge to the well, or if you're unlucky, to the frozen creek nearby. The bucket rope is stiff, frozen in place, and your gloves don't so much insulate as they politely whisper, "Good luck with frostbite." Hauling icy water isn't glamorous, but it is survival. Wells often froze shallow, leaving you with a heavy pole to break the ice, hacking until the echo of splintering frost bounces around like a drumbeat. Historians still argue whether settlers adapted more quickly to this chore than European newcomers. Those from colder climates certainly had an edge, but many families had to learn the hard way that water could be more stubborn than wolves. You carry the sloshing bucket back to the cabin, hands numb, a splash soaking your trousers and freezing instantly. Congratulations, you've just invented frontier skinny jeans, stiff, icy, and extremely uncomfortable. Inside, the stove hisses as you pour a little in to boil. Steam curls upward, and for a moment you feel triumphant. Until someone reminds you that there are animals outside, waiting for water too. Chores multiply like rabbits. Firewood doesn't split itself. You heft an axe nearly as tall as you are, and march toward the log pile, which is half buried in snow. The blade bites into the wood with a satisfying thunk, but soon your muscles ache, sweat beads on your forehead, and instantly freezes. Splitting wood was a daily grind. Every family needed cords and cords to make it through winter. One quirky tidbit: some settlers swore by stacking logs in elaborate crisscross towers to scare off evil spirits. More likely, it just kept the wood drier, but hey, if it also warded off ghosts, two birds with one log. As the morning stretches, more chores beckon: feeding animals, checking traps, sweeping snow from the roof before it collapses under weight. The average day demanded strength and speed, and you, with your modern office muscles, are already wondering if you can fake a sprained ankle. Don't count on sympathy. Frontier families expected everyone to pitch in, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent. Little hands might fetch kindling, stir a pot of porridge, or chase chickens. Even elderly family members often spun wool, mended clothes, or offered endless advice from a rocking chair. That last contribution could be both a blessing and a curse. Breakfast is hardly a feast. You spoon out thick porridge, maybe flavored with molasses if you're lucky. More often, it's just plain cornmeal mush, steaming in a rough wooden bowl. Fresh bread is a luxury reserved for Sundays or special occasions when flour is plentiful. The children grumble, and you secretly join them, dreaming of butter, jam, and maybe even coffee. Frontier coffee, however, was often roasted acorns or chicory root pretending to be coffee. Let's just say Starbucks would not have approved. As you eat, the cold seeps back in, reminding you that firewood will burn faster than you can split it, and water will freeze faster than you can carry it. Winter wasn't a single battle. It was a war fought every morning, every hour, and sometimes every minute. And still, families endured it together. There's a rhythm to it all. Wake, fetch water, chop wood, cook, mend, repeat. Days blurred, nights stretched long, and yet life pressed on. Historians debate whether this constant physical grind created stronger community bonds or drove people quietly mad. Evidence exists for both. Some families left diaries full of warmth and gratitude for shared hardship, while others wrote only of endless quarrels and a longing to pack up and leave. And yet, as you step outside once more, hearing the crunch of snow under your boots and watching the pale sun rise sluggishly above the horizon, there is a peculiar peace. The world is silent except for the groan of trees, the flap of a raven's wings, and the sound of your own breath. You may be miserable, cold, and sore, but you're also alive. And in the frontier, that was a victory worth noting. The chores have barely settled into a rhythm before you realize another problem: food. You can chop wood, carry water, and patch walls all you like. But without food in winter, the frontier quickly reminds you just how fragile survival really is. You open the root cellar door, if you're lucky enough to have one, and a puff of air rises that is colder than the cabin itself, carrying the scent of earth and preserved vegetables. The cellar is dug deep into the ground, lined with logs or stone, and covered in straw to keep it from freezing solid. Inside, baskets of shriveled turnips, wrinkled apples, and maybe some onions wait patiently. They look like survivors too, gnarled and unimpressive, but still edible. Salt barrels dominate one corner, packed tight with pork or venison. The meat floats in its briny bath, not exactly appetizing, but dependable. Without refrigeration, salt was the great guardian of frontier diets. Every bite carried the sharp tang of preservation, and you could almost hear your arteries sigh in protest. Quirky detail. Some families use salt so generously that historians still puzzle over how their blood pressure didn't simply explode. The answer might lie in the sheer physical work. They burned off whatever harm the salt carried by hauling, chopping, and enduring. Then there's dried food. Apples strung like garlands, strips of jerky stiff as leather, beans stored in rough sacks. Frontier families relied on these staples, soaking beans overnight or chewing jerky until their jaws ached. It wasn't fine dining, but it kept you alive. Occasionally, when the monotony grew unbearable, someone dug into the small stash of molasses or honey, stirring it into cornbread or porridge. Sweetness was a luxury, savored slowly. Imagine everyone in the family leaning in for a single spoonful, as if sugar itself were a guest at the table. Food storage, of course, wasn't foolproof. Mice had a way of infiltrating cellars, leaving telltale gnawed edges. Some families kept cats indoors not as pets, but as hired security. A good mouser earned its keep as surely as a cow or chicken. And speaking of cows, you'd better check the milk supply. In winter, milk production slowed drastically. Cows needed fodder, dried hay, storts in summer, and water that hadn't turned to ice. If your cow wasn't happy, neither was your breakfast. Historians still argue whether starvation was the exception or the rule in isolated settlements. Diaries from some families describe winters of relative plenty, where hunting and storage worked beautifully, while others recall weeks of scraping the bottom of barrels, grinding up acorns, and stretching a single rabbit to feed 6 mouths. It often came down to luck, whether the crops grew, whether the hunt was successful, and whether the weather decided to be merciful. Then there's the odd fact that some settlers experimented with foods you might hesitate over. Bark bread, made by mixing ground inner tree bark with flour, made an appearance in especially lean years. It filled the belly, but not much else. Fish heads, boiled to release every scrap of fat, became soup. Even candles, made of tallow that is, were rumored to have been nibbled in the worst emergencies. You might laugh at the idea now, but after a few days of watery gruel, that candle would start to look suspiciously like dessert. Breakfast over, you glance at the shelves and realize how much depends on careful rationing. One careless feast, and you could be short weeks later. Children sneaking a piece of jerky were scolded harshly, not out of cruelty, but fear. That single stolen bite might be the difference between a family making it to spring or not. Modern pantries overflow with snacks. frontier pantries overflowed only with worry. Yet, despite the constant strain, meals carried their own quiet joy. Families gathered close, bowls steaming in their hands, breath rising into the air like smoke. Conversation was simple: the weather, the animals, a neighbor spotted trudging through snow. But there was comfort in the ritual. Eating together meant you'd made it through another night, and you had the strength to face another day. One last quirky tidbit: some settlers swore that onions kept better when buried in sand, while others said hanging them from rafters was the secret. Even now, food historians can't agree which was the superior method, but the image of a cabin ceiling draped in dangling onions is somehow both practical and unintentionally decorative. Call it frontier interior design, functional, fragrant, and guaranteed to keep vampires at bay. You finish your morning meal and look down at what you're wearing. It's already soaked through in patches from snow, stiff at the knees from frozen splashes of water, and you've barely started the day. Clothing on the frontier wasn't fashion. It was survival. Forget silk and fine tailoring. You are swaddled in layers that would make a modern stylist faint. Wool, leather, homespun cotton, furs, whatever kept you warm became your wardrobe, and the colder it got, the more mismatched and lumpy you looked. You start with long undergarments, scratchy wool that clings to your skin like a prickly blanket. Over that go trousers, patched in 3 places, then another layer if you've got it. Shirts were thick linen or wool, sometimes a borrowed flannel. Then came coats, buffalo hide if you were rich, sheepskin if you were practical, patched quilted jackets if you were neither. Every family member wore whatever they had, and if that meant dad's old coat hung to your ankles, then congratulations. You've just started the first frontier fashion trend, hand-me-down chic. Historians still argue whether frontier families prioritized clothing as much as food, but diaries suggest both were equally urgent. A good coat could mean the difference between tending animals in a snowstorm or watching them die while you shivered indoors. Some mothers spent winter nights spinning wool and stitching new mittens from old rags, their needles clicking in rhythm with the howling wind. One quirky tidbit: some pioneers made shoes by stuffing cloth into worn-out leather, creating a kind of lumpy, soggy slipper. Effective? Sort of. Stylish? Absolutely not. Hats and scarves were non-negotiable. Men often wore fur caps pulled low over their ears. Women wrapped shawls multiple times around their necks, and children disappeared entirely under layers of knitted scraps. You might laugh at how absurdly bundled they looked, but if you ever walked out on a January morning and felt your eyelashes freeze, you'll understand why nobody cared about appearances. And then there were gloves, or sometimes the lack thereof. Leather mittens lined with wool were a treasure, passed down and patched until they barely resembled gloves at all. In desperation, settlers wrapped hands in rags, winding them like makeshift bandages. One journal even mentions a man using rabbit pelts as mittens, slipping his hands inside like furry puppets. Strange, yes. But when your fingers are on the edge of frostbite, dignity takes a back seat. Quilts doubled as coats, coats doubled as blankets, and sometimes blankets doubled as doors, hung across open gaps to block drafts. Clothing wasn't just for wearing, it was architecture, insulation, and lifeline. A single wool cloak could mean warmth for a child at night or padding for a weary adult during chores. Nothing was wasted. Of course, there was humor even in misery. Imagine tripping over a hem because your coat is 3 sizes too big, or watching someone waddle stiffly because they've layered so many garments they resemble a walking mattress. Joke number 1, the frontier gave birth to the original puffer jacket, except instead of sleek nylon, it was an overstuffed quilt that smelled faintly of smoke and cabbage. But clothing wasn't only practical, it carried identity. A coonskin cap might mark a hunter, while a bonnet identified a farm wife. Children wore miniature versions of adult clothes, tiny wool trousers, little shawls that made them look like solemn, shrunken grown-ups. Families took pride in repairing garments neatly, embroidering initials, or adding a bit of color from plant-based dyes. Even amid the drudgery, people sought beauty. One curious fact: some communities traded clothing across families. circulating garments the way modern neighborhoods might swap tools. You never knew if your mittens had warmed someone else's hands last winter. This silent sharing created bonds stronger than gossip, though gossip still came free of charge. And here's the second joke. When spring finally came, settlers often peeled off layers and realized they'd lost weight from the hard winter. They'd shuffle in trousers now sagging at the waist, announcing the first ever frontier diet plan. Guaranteed results, no membership fee required, just a little frostbite and endless chores. Scholars still debate the psychological effect of living wrapped in layers day and night. Did it make people feel safer, like armor against the elements? Or did it become a burden, a reminder that nature had the upper hand? Either way, you can't escape it. You tug your shawl tighter, stomp your boots to shake out snow, and step back into the day's labor. One more joke to leave with. Frontier wardrobes didn't need closets. You were wearing everything you owned all at once. Decision fatigue solved. The stove glows steadily, but you know that glow is hungry. Firewood vanishes at an alarming rate, each log crackling into ash faster than you can split replacements. Out here, warmth isn't free. It's measured in blisters, sore shoulders, and time stolen from other chores. You step outside again, the axe heavy in your hands, the snow crunching beneath your boots, and stare at the stubborn pile of logs. Splitting wood is one of those tasks that looks heroic in paintings and feels miserable in reality. The blade sticks more often than it slices cleanly. You raise the axe again and again, shoulders screaming, until finally a log splits in two with a sharp crack. Satisfaction floods in for half a second before you remember. That's one log. You'll need hundreds. Joke number 1, firewood doesn't care about your personal fitness goals. It invents them for you. Inside, the iron stove is temperamental. Some days it behaves like a loyal friend, radiating warmth steadily. Other days it smokes spitefully, filling the cabin with haze and leaving you coughing. Historians still argue whether poorly built chimneys were to blame, or if settlers simply underestimated how finicky draft control could be. Either way, the phrase, "don't let the fire go out," wasn't just practical advice. It was a survival mantra. To make things worse, wood wasn't always ready when you needed it. Freshly chopped logs hissed with steam, refusing to burn properly. Families had to plan months ahead, splitting and stacking wood in summer so it could dry. Forget to do that, and by January, you'd be crouched desperately over a pile of green logs, blowing until you were lightheaded, praying smoke would become flame. Joke number 2. Nothing teaches you patience like waiting for damp wood to pretend it's dry. Even when the stove worked, the heat distribution was laughable. Stand too close and your shins roasted like marshmallows. Step a few feet away and your back froze solid. Bedrooms, if a cabin had more than one, rarely got any heat at all. Some settlers left windows cracked, despite the cold, simply to avoid suffocating smoke. Imagine explaining that to your modern self. Yes, we let the freezing air in, but at least we can breathe. And then there's the fuel itself. Not every family could afford endless wood. Some supplemented with dried corn cobs, twisted bundles of straw, or even dried animal dung. Prairie families especially relied on cow chips, gathered in summer and stacked carefully for winter use. It burned hot, it burned clean, and it certainly gave new meaning to the phrase, "waste not, want not." Historians still chuckle over whether this practice was shameful or simply practical. But when the wind rattled the shutters, practicality always won. Children often helped gather kindling, combing the snowy ground for sticks. Older kids carried armloads of logs inside, stacking them neatly by the stove. It was work, yes, but also a rhythm of family life. Everyone knew their role, because one missing armful could mean a miserable night. And that unity, grumbling though it may have been, helped families push through. Picture the cabin now, stove clattering, smoke curling lazily, flames casting jittery shadows across rough log walls. The air smells of pine, resin, and smoke so thick you can taste it. Your clothes soak it in, your hair soaks it in, your quilt soaks it in. Joke number 3, who needs perfume when everyone already smells like eau de bonfire? And yet, there's comfort in it too. You settle near the stove, feeling your toes thaw, listening to the hiss of sap in burning wood. The fire is alive, almost companionable. In the howling wilderness, that steady crackle becomes your heartbeat, reminding you that for now you are safe. Night leans in again, soft and heavy, and the glow you wrestled from the stove settles into a steady hush. The iron ticks as it cools. The room smells of smoke and wool, your signature eau de bonfire, with a faint garnish from those onions still dangling from the rafters. You move by muscle memory now. Bank the coals under a blanket of ash for morning, check the latch against the sly wind, and begin the last ritual of winter survival, turning a drafty corner of the world into a bed you can actually sleep in. First comes the straw tick. It isn't a mattress so much as a giant cloth sausage, stuffed with straw or corn husks, stitched tight and flipped now and then so the lumps don't organize a mutiny against your spine. When the weather softens, you'll haul it outside and beat it in the sunshine until a polite dust storm announces that housekeeping is underway. Tonight, you thump it flat, then test the ropes under the bed frame. Rope beds sag like tired hammocks unless you tighten them with a small iron key, the bed wrench. Historians still argue whether the phrase "sleep tight" came from those tightened ropes or simply meant sleep soundly. But either way, you give the ropes a final tug and pretend science has blessed your back. Heat is the next puzzle. There's no electric blanket, only cunning. You warm a flat iron by the stove and wrap it in cloth, or slip a brick into the coals and ferry it, hissing, obedient, to the foot of the bed. In plenty of New England homes, a brass warming pan carried embers beneath the sheets, slid back and forth like a cautious violin bow. It works, though it also has a talent for scorching linen and beginning conversations you do not want to have with your bucket of water. Quirky tidbit for the win. A baked potato makes a remarkably loyal bed warmer. Tuck it under the quilt, sleep, then eat your breakfast right out of the blankets. Frontier multitasking. You build the layers, patch quilts, a wool blanket with more darns than original fiber, maybe a fur throw if you're lucky. Quilts become their own frontier chronicle. Log cabin blocks stitched from worn shirts, 9-patch squares born from old calico, a tiny red hearth at the center. Winter quilting bees are the neighborhood's heartbeat. By lamplight, needles flash, stories bloom, and someone's spare sleeve quietly becomes tomorrow's warmth. That gathering around a frame is a mainstream fact of frontier life. Community work turning into community rest, one stitch at a time. Nightwear matters. You pull on a nightcap, the least glamorous hat known to humankind, and thick socks that climb your calves. If you've got them, mittens join the party. Nobody laughs at mittens in bed when the rafters wear frost like jewels. Children wriggle into a trundle pulled from under the main bed, close enough to borrow heat, far enough that a grown-up can still swing out for the chamber pot without stepping on toes. Privacy is a myth. Warmth is the rule. Joke 1. You finally achieved the coveted frontier weighted blanket, also known as every coat you own, stacked on your torso like an especially heavy hug. Beds here talk. The ropes creak, the tick sighs, and the frame offers a slow wooden whale song every time you roll. You and the bed agree to a truce. It promises not to collapse if you promise not to move much. Now and then a feather bed appears, a luxury in a sea of straw, but even that can betray you, slumping into cold valleys and warm peaks where your knees become cartographers of every dip. Still, compared to the floor, a lumpy heaven is heaven enough. The lantern sinks to amber. Someone reads a psalm softly, and the tallow candle does its familiar gutter and recover dance while you ration every inch of wick. You check the stove one last time, ash pulled over the coals so dawn begins with a hopeful ember, and then you burrow. The linen remembers every winter and rustles a warning. Lie still, and it might agree to be warm. Comfort is creative. A stone bottle filled with hot water masquerades as a faithful footman. A small dog curls behind your knees and claims the rank of honorary heating appliance. The cat settles on your feet with the solemn duty of purring you to sleep. Someone slides the hot brick into its special bed sock so the sheets don't scorch. Future laundry thanks past you. Joke 2. Once you're tucked, nightcap, socks, mittens, quilts, you achieve human burrito status. If anyone needed you urgently, you'd have to roll to the door like a well-insulated log. Just before drifting, combs appear. Lice exist, though everyone prefers not to discuss it. A dab of vinegar here, a heated comb there, and the problem recedes enough to ignore until spring beating day when bedding is marched outside for a grand exorcism by sunlight and sticks. A pinch of dried mint or sage inside the tick adds a whisper of freshness to the smoke and wool bouquet. Will it help? Perhaps. Will it smell better? Definitely. You breathe in that odd, comforting mixture. The year's scraps literally stitched into tonight's survival, and the room feels smaller, kinder. Outside, the cold plays its old song on the eaves, a crystalline chirp the old-timers call snow squeak. Air so dry it refuses to be kind. The dog shifts near the door. If you're lucky, the cat repositions and becomes a purring hot water bottle you don't have to reheat. The cabin settles. Somewhere, a mouse considers your pantry and thinks better of it because the mouser is awake. The rope bed gives one complaining creak, as if clearing its throat before sleep. You remember the day, ice in the bucket, the axe in your hands, the smoke in your hair. The bed forgives all of it. It takes your weight, your sighs, your half-formed prayers. If you wake briefly, as many do on long winter nights, you murmur a few words, check the coal's orange pulse, take a swallow of water that tastes like tin in January, and slide back under the quilts before the chill can argue. The hours fold themselves away like shirts in a chest, one more night toward spring. Joke 3. You're wrapped so thoroughly you could tumble out of bed and waddle away still wearing the entire bedding set like a fashionable cocoon. It's not style, it's survival. But in the dark, the two look pleasantly similar. Before your eyes close completely, you perform the last ritual. Reach down with a wool-socked foot and find the heat left by the brick or that loyal potato. Your toes sigh, the quilts exhale, the creaks turn to lullabies. The cabin is still the same drafty box of sticks and hope it was at dawn, but now it's a nest, and you are tucked inside it, held by ropes and patchwork and all the careful hands that stitch this shelter from scraps. You won't dream of luxury. You'll dream of ordinary things done well, a tighter knot in the bed rope, a thicker quilt next winter, a spring day when the tick is emptied onto clean grass and filled again with sweet straw. And in those dreams, there's the steady promise. If the fire holds, if the roof keeps, if the snow relents, you'll wake to another morning and do it all again. A little sleepier, a little tougher, still here. The quilts are drawn tight, your toes blessedly warm by the last trace of a brick wrapped in cloth, and the cabin sinks into its nighttime rhythm. The glow of fire dwindles into a faint blush through the stove door. Shadows rise and fall across the walls, long and exaggerated, like they too are trying to stretch against the cold. And in this half-darkness, with the night creeping in, lanterns and candles step forward to keep the frontier from dissolving entirely into black. You strike flint against steel, coaxing sparks into a wick. A lantern comes to life, its flame a jittery golden eye. It hisses faintly when the oil wick smokes, then steadies. The glass chimney clouds with soot almost immediately. Keeping it clear is an endless, fussy chore. Historians still argue whether settlers preferred whale oil, lard, or tallow as their standby fuel, but every choice smoked, smelled, and sometimes sputtered out in the middle of your reading. Modern light bulbs, by comparison, feel like sorcery. On the table, a tallow candle burns unevenly, dripping fat onto a tin saucer. A child pokes at the wax with a stick, sculpting shapes until scolded. Joke number 1. Frontier children were the original candle influencers, except instead of carving trendy designs, they mostly just ruined the wick. The glow these little flames provide is barely enough. You squint at a Bible verse, stumbling over the cramped print. Maybe you read a letter sent months ago, the ink faded, words carrying news that is already outdated. Or perhaps you don't read at all. You mend socks, shell beans, or carve a wooden spoon, letting the flickering light guide your hands more by habit than vision. Long winter nights meant long stretches of this faint glow. Families gathered close to conserve candles, so the living room became the library, the workshop, the confessional booth, and the stage for gossip. A neighbor might drop in, stamping snow off boots, cheeks flushed red, and suddenly the flickering circle of light swells with laughter and stories. The fire crackles, The lantern hums and the wind scratches at the window panes like a bored cat. Quirky tidbit. Some pioneers made their own candles with rush lights, soaking dried rushes in animal fat. They were cheap, they burned quickly, and they smelled faintly like, well, barnyard. Better than complete darkness, worse than anything else. But they became part of the rhythm. Light a rush for a quick task, then let it gutter out before bed. Time under this dim light moved strangely. Sometimes the night stretched forever. Other times, with laughter or a fiddle tune, it slipped past like a dream. Historians debate whether these evenings fostered intimacy or simply boredom. Some journals describe warmth, storytelling, and togetherness, while others confess to suffocating monotony. Every shadow the same, every story repeated until it frayed like an old shirt. Still, there is a certain magic in the flicker. Your eyes grow heavy, lulled by the gentle dance of flame. Shadows lean in and lean back, as though listening to your breath. Joke number 2, nothing says bedtime routine like accidentally setting your nightcap on fire when you lean too close. Don't worry, you'd smell it before you singe too much hair. Probably. The lantern sputters, reminding you fuel is scarce. Every drop of oil is measured, every wick trimmed with care. Children learn to respect flame early. An overturned lantern means disaster. Cabins went up fast, and snow couldn't always put out a blaze. So families developed rituals. Never leave a candle alone, always snuff with care, and pray the wind doesn't find its way through a crack. But danger aside, there is comfort here. The flame is alive, a fragile companion. It transforms the cabin into a small, glowing cave, the vast frozen wilderness pressed back into silence. You settle into a chair, quilt pulled over your knees, listening to the murmur of voices fading into yawns. The oil hisses one last time, the wick curls into ash, and the room sinks deeper into shadow. Joke number 3, when the candle finally dies, you lie in bed whispering, Alexa, turn the light back on, and realize, no, you are the Alexa. If you want light, you'll have to get up, grope for flint, and start the whole sputtering dance again. So you let the darkness win. The last flame sighs into smoke, the lantern fades, the quilts weigh heavy, and the cabin seems to sigh into silence. But silence on the frontier is never complete. A cough, a restless shift, the scrape of snow slipping from the roof, and then, always the creeping thought, what happens when sickness comes calling in the middle of winter? Out here, the nearest doctor is often days away, if one exists at all. You don't call for help, you improvise. Illness is a constant shadow. A sore throat lingers, a cough deepens, and soon half the family is huddled around the stove, sipping strange brews. Frontier medicine was equal parts practicality, superstition, and desperate hope. Historians still argue whether settlers relied more heavily on European folk cures or adopted native remedies they encountered, but most agree the result was a patchwork of trial and error. Some worked brilliantly, others were little more than wishful thinking. You take a sip of willow bark tea, bitter enough to make you wince. Modern science would later confirm it contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. At the time, it was just one of many concoctions passed from neighbor to neighbor. For a fever, someone might brew a tea from yarrow or elderflower. For stomach cramps, mint leaves steeped in hot water. For wounds, a poultice of bread and milk, or, less appetizingly, mashed onions. Quirky tidbit, goose grease rubbed on the chest was a favorite cough remedy, usually paired with a mustard plaster that stung like fire. Imagine lying in bed smelling like both a roast dinner and a spice market, and you'll get the picture. If herbs failed, the remedies grew stranger. Spiderwebs pressed against cuts as makeshift bandages. Whiskey poured down the throat to warm the blood. Vinegar baths to chase away chills. Joke number 1, if it stung, burned, or tasted vile, odds were good someone swore it worked. The biggest dread, of course, was serious illness, diphtheria, pneumonia, or influenza. Without antibiotics, these could sweep through a household with terrifying speed. Families leaned hard on isolation, prayer, and whatever poultices they could scrape together. Historians debate whether the harsh winters helped by slowing contagion or made things worse by forcing families into tight, smoky cabins where germs spread like gossip. The truth probably lies in between. Even the smallest ailments became battles. A toothache could leave you moaning for weeks until someone finally yanked it with pliers heated in the fire. Frostbite turned fingers black, and the cure was often to rub them with snow, a practice now recognized as disastrous but then passed down with conviction. Children caught croup, and parents sat through the night holding them upright, praying each wheezing breath wasn't the last. Yet, amid the fear, there was resilience. Remedies weren't just medicine, they were acts of care. A mother stirring herbs in boiling water, a father tightening blankets around a feverish child, neighbors trudging through snow to deliver dried sage or honey. All of it said, "You are not alone." And sometimes, that mattered as much as the cure itself. One journal tells of families hanging red flannel strips in windows as a sign of sickness, both warning and plea. Others describe midnight visits when someone arrived with a jar of goose grease, swearing it could cure anything from coughs to heartbreak. Joke number 2. Frontier goose grease might not mend a broken heart, but at least you'd be too slippery to be hugged awkwardly while grieving. Of course, not all remedies were equal. Some were downright dangerous. Mercury pills, opium tinctures, or bleeding with leeches, all carried over from older European traditions, were still in circulation. You imagine lying weak in bed while someone insists that draining a pint of your blood will make you stronger. At that point, you'd almost prefer the onion poultice. Almost. Quirky fact: children often became unofficial herb scouts, sent to collect dandelions, spruce tips, or sumac berries in warmer months, which were then dried and stored for winter use. Their little hands filled jars, not realizing they were stocking the family pharmacy. It was work, but it was also insurance. One more way to tilt survival in your favor. And through it all, you learn one truth. Sickness was a winter guest you couldn't bar from the door. You could only meet it with what you had: herbs, plasters, prayers, and the unshakable will to endure. Joke number 3. If you ever doubted human stubbornness, remember that some families rubbed raw onions on their feet to cure colds. Did it work? Historians still argue, but one thing's certain: nobody wanted to sit too close at the quilting bee afterward. The night outside is a slow breathing thing, snow whispering against the door, the moon painting the yard the color of skim milk. You sit with your back to the stove, feeling heat fade from your wool socks when the dog gives a single serious woof. That is not the squirrel memoir woof. That is the someone's coming woof. You listen, and there it is. The careful crunch of footsteps over crusted snow, long pauses between each step, as if the walker is measuring out courage with every yard. Neighbors on the frontier don't always arrive at noon. Sometimes they arrive at midnight, bearing soup, news, or need. You lift the iron latch, and because you keep old sayings alive without thinking, you've left the latch string out. That small loop of leather or cord through the door isn't decoration, it's code. Out means welcome. Pull it in when you need privacy. Quirky tidbit, yes, but also everyday life. Hospitality turned into hardware. Tonight you haven't pulled it in. The door opens on a hush of cold and a gust that smells like stars and pine. Your neighbor stands there powdered in frost, breath streaming, scarf iced into stiff petals. He holds a tin pail swaddled in cloth, stew still warm, a message that says what words can't. We see you, we remember you, keep going. He stamps once, twice, to free his boots, and a spray of ice skitters across your floorboards. Joke 1. Congratulations. Your foyer has become a limited edition indoor skating rink. Admission price: 1 ladle of stew. You wave him in, hang his coat near the stove where it sighs and begins to steam, and pass a cup. News arrives with him, because news travels best wrapped in a shared bowl. A chimney down at the Millers, a calf born early at the Andersons, a letter at the post road if the snow lets the sleigh through. Out here, no one has a feed to scroll. The neighborhood is the feed, and it loads at the speed of boots. Mutual aid is not charity here. it is oxygen. A barn raising in summer, a quilting bee in winter. These aren't quaint extras, but the backbone of survival. That's a mainstream fact historians agree on. Communities pooled labor in bees and frolics, trading time instead of coins. Tonight's version is smaller and colder, just two families measuring out warmth, but the math is the same. You offer dried apples. He hands over an extra wedge of tallow. Tomorrow, when your stove door hinge grinds, he'll show up with a file. Anyone sick? You ask softly, and his face tells the story before he speaks. A cough, a fever, a baby who won't settle. When the next knock comes, lighter, breathless, it's his teenage daughter with a message tucked in her mitten. Could your wife come sit the night and mind the little ones? On the frontier, the nearest midwife might be a mile away, or might be the woman smoothing the quilt on your own bed. Historians still argue whether winter isolation hardened people into solitary survivalists or knitted them tighter into webbing strong enough to catch a fall. The diaries cut both ways, but nights like this lean toward knitting. You pack quickly, not luxuries, useful things. The go basket lives by the door. A roll of bandaged linen, a jar of goose grease that now smells like the whole past week, a twist of willow bark, a needle and strong thread, a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, and the surprise favorite, your faithful hot brick in its sock. Remember the baked potato trick? You tuck one into the basket too, because a warm potato in a cold hand is better than a sermon. You add a scoop of your sourdough, mother, a living, bubbling comfort passed from kitchen to kitchen. Frontier social media, one starter, many followers. Stepping out again, you taste the metallic hush of snow. The sky is loud with stars. Your lantern throws a small bubble of amber on the trail, and the world beyond is velvet. You walk single file behind your neighbor, his snowshoes whispering a steady shush shush. Every 100 yards the snow complains with that crystalline squeak the old-timers recognize. It's so cold the night has a voice. Joke 2. If you slip and fall, at least you'll leave behind a snow angel. Call it your polite calling card. Paths between homesteads aren't highways, they're agreements. Two families wear a route into the drifts, turn by the leaning birch, cross the creek where the ice keeps faith. When the wind erases the prints, you navigate by memory. The scent of spruce, the way the slope tilts underfoot, the familiar complaint of a fence post. Sometimes a lantern shines from a distant window like a punctuation mark. Comma for we're awake. Period for all's well. Sometimes there's only darkness and the sense that you are walking inside a story older than fences. At the Andersons, warm air and panic greet you together. A kettle rattles. The baby's cry comes in short, sharp bursts. You don't bring miracles. You bring presents. You settle the littlest by the hearth with a slice of bread spread with a thumbprint of honey. Slide the potato into the mother's hands and trade your brick to the oldest boy to park. Ceremoniously, at the foot of the bed, you brew the willow, you rub a chest with grease, you murmur the psalm you could say asleep. The father's shoulders drop a fraction. It's enough. This is how information travels too. You mention the miller's fallen chimney. Two teenagers volunteer to take the hand sledge at first light with rope and nails. You ask after a letter. Someone remembers seeing the post runner at the river, frozen but stubborn, promising to try the crossing at dawn. A quilt shifts from one bed to another. A jar of beans changes cupboards. The ledger stays in everyone's head, paid not with silver but with steps in the snow. Historians still argue whether such exchanges created lasting egalitarianism or simply disguised hierarchies in places where cash was scarce. Out here at midnight, it looks simple. You help because someday you will need help. A little laughter finds its way in because the body knows how to fix a room. Someone tells the story of old Mrs. Hanrahan walking to a berth with a lantern so iced the flame kept burning inside a glass snowball. Someone else swears he saw a moose use the path like a polite neighbor, single file and sighing. Joke 3. You admit you once knocked on the wrong cabin in a snowfall, delivered stew to a very confused cow. The baby hiccups, then sighs. A truce with the night. On the walk back, the cold is sharpened, but you carry heat with you. On your skin from the crowded room, in your pocket from the potato now a little less plump, in your mind from the news, the promises made, the sense that you are stitched to a map larger than your cabin's four walls. The snowfield looks less like emptiness and more like the blank page between lines of handwriting where the meaning rests. Your door receives you with a soft thump. Inside, your own people breathe in different lengths. Someone dreams, someone snores, someone mumbles about that onion poultice you all agreed to stop talking about. The stove welcomes the last of the day's sticks. You slide the latch, leave the string out. The code holds. If someone else knocks at 2, you will rise again, because that's what midnight is for out here, tending the fire that lives between houses. The rooster might still be dreaming, but you're awake, tugging on stiff boots and listening to the low, impatient sound drifting from the barn. Animals don't care that the air bites like needles, or that your muscles ache from chopping wood yesterday. They want water, feed, and a little kindness, or at least the frontier version of kindness, which usually comes in the form of a frozen bucket and a muttered prayer. You push the barn door open. It resists, swollen with ice, then groans wide enough to let you squeeze through. The smell hits instantly. Hay, manure, warm breath, thick and oddly comforting after the sterile bite of outdoors. Inside, it's dim but alive. Cows shifting heavily, horses stamping frost from their hooves, chickens muttering as though they too have complaints about this endless winter. Steam rises in little puffs from their bodies, proof that the barn is warmer than the house in some ways. First job, water. The trough is a sheet of ice thick enough to skate on. You take an axe or an iron bar and smash a hole, each blow ringing like a cracked bell in the cold air. Shards glitter as you scoop them out. The cows crowd forward, long tongues curling to lap greedily at the fresh opening. Quirky tidbit. Some families claimed their cows recognized the sound of ice breaking and would shuffle impatiently as soon as they heard the first crack. Joke number 1. If Pavlov had lived on the frontier, his bell would have been an axe against a trough. Feeding is next. Hay bales are stacked in the loft, dusty and prickling against your skin as you drag them down. A pitchfork stabs into the bundle and you spread it across the stalls, the sweet sour smell filling your nose. Horses toss their heads, appreciative. Chickens scratch at scattered kernels, clucking like gossiping neighbors. Pigs grunt, demanding their share, and you oblige with scraps saved from the table. Nothing is wasted, not peelings, not bones, not crumbs. Every bit becomes pig fat, eggs, or milk in return. The barn is a world of sounds. The rhythmic chew of cows grinding hay, the swish of tails brushing against wooden walls, the low nicker of a horse who thinks you're late, though you've been up since before dawn. Children often took on these chores, small hands lugging buckets half their size. They slipped, spilled, got soaked, and still trudged back for more. Historians still argue whether this labor hardened them into sturdy adults or simply wore them down too soon. Perhaps both. You rub a horse's neck, feeling the thick winter coat under your palm. Frontier animals had to be as tough as their owners, weathering storms in drafty barns and long nights on frozen ground. Some settlers knitted blankets from patched sacks to keep calves warm. Others swore by rubbing them down with burlap. Quirky detail. A few even made earmuffs for calves, little knitted pouches tied over tender ears to keep frostbite at bay. Fashionable? Not exactly. Effective? Sometimes. The barn cats weave around your ankles, eyes glowing in the lantern light. They are not pets, not really, but employees, paid in mice. Their presence keeps your grain safer. They're purring a quiet hymn to domesticity in an otherwise harsh world. And though you don't say it out loud, you're glad for them when the nights grow long. Joke number 2. Feeding time in the barn is basically the frontier version of rush hour. Everyone pushes, no one waits their turn, and somebody always leaves a mess you'll have to clean up later. As you work, your breath fogs the air, mingling with the steam of the animals. The barn becomes a living cloud, warm and noisy compared to the silence outside. You pause, leaning on the pitchfork, and listen. It's not just chores, it's ritual. This care is what ties you to the land. Without these animals, there is no milk, no butter, no strength to haul, no future calves to trade. Their survival is your survival. Still, the barn holds its own hazards. A kick from a startled cow can bruise for weeks. A horse slipping on frozen ground can end more than just a day's work. And the smell, Well, that's the price of warmth. You step carefully, boots crunching straw, reminding yourself that even discomfort has a rhythm you can get used to. Historians debate whether barns were cleaner or filthier than cabins. Some argue animals provided extra heat that families leaned on in bitter cold, while others note how quickly disease spread in close quarters. Either way, you accept the trade. A barn is messier, but it's also a promise of milk at dawn, eggs at noon, and a stronger plow team come spring. Joke number 3. Frontier families sometimes joke that the cows were the warmest neighbors they had, loyal, quiet, and always home by curfew. You finish with a final sweep of straw, pat the dog who's been sniffing every corner, and step back out into the biting wind. Behind you, the barn hums with contentment. Animals settled, chores complete, for now. Ahead of you, another day waits, filled with cold and work, but also with the quiet assurance that life, in its stubborn way, continues. You leave the barn behind, boots crunching through snow, and head back toward the cabin. The wind cuts across the yard like a knife you forgot to put away, sharp and rude, but it isn't the cold that keeps you awake tonight. It's the sounds. Out here, silence is never quite silent. You crawl back under the quilts, stove faintly ticking, and your ears open wide to every creak, every sigh of the cabin's timbers, every long moan of the trees outside. At first, it's just the wood shifting. The logs of the cabin expand and contract with the cold, popping and groaning like an old man with stiff joints. You tell yourself it's nothing, but in the middle of the night, when you're half asleep, each pop feels like a knock. Historians still argue whether settlers truly believed spirits haunted their cabins, or if those ghost stories were simply a way to explain away the unnerving sounds of timber and ice. Either way, plenty of journals describe families whispering prayers when a particularly loud crack echoed through the rafters. Then comes the wildlife chorus. Wolves, their howls drifting across the frozen forest, a sound both mournful and menacing. Coyotes yip back, shrill laughter that raises goose flesh along your arms. The dog at the door growls low, ears perked. You know wolves are shy, unlikely to risk a lit cabin, but that knowledge doesn't stop the shiver when their voices braid through the night air. Quirky tidbit. Some families swore they could tell the number of wolves in a pack just by the harmony of their howls, as if it were frontier math set to music. The wind joins in next, whistling through every crack in the cabin walls. Sometimes it hums, sometimes it screeches, and sometimes it simply sighs, a long exhale as if the earth itself is tired of winter. The draft across your face makes the candle gutter. You tug the quilt higher and imagine the house itself is breathing. Joke number 1. If you close your eyes, the cabin almost sounds like it's snoring, your largest, loudest family member. But the worst sounds are the ones you can't name. A branch scraping across the roof, scratching like claws, snow slipping off in a sudden thud that jolts you awake, the muffled crunch of something, deer, raccoon, or something else, moving just beyond the door. Frontier families lived without fences, without streetlights, without the illusion of control. Every noise at night was a reminder that you were only borrowing this little patch of wilderness. Children often whispered stories in the dark, ghostly travelers, phantom fiddlers, witches riding the storm winds. The older folks joined in too, half laughing, half serious, because storytelling was as much insulation as quilts. One quirky detail: Appalachian settlers sometimes hammered horseshoes above doors, not just for luck, but to ward off witches who, according to lore, hated iron. Joke number 2. Of course, if the witch happened to be a blacksmith, you were probably out of luck. Fear had its uses. It kept people cautious, alert to the world outside. But too much fear could eat you alive in the long months of snow. Historians debate whether those eerie sounds drove more settlers to abandon their claims than hunger or debt. Some accounts say yes. Loneliness and dread were heavier burdens than even ice on the roof. Others insist the fear bonded families tighter, each noise a reason to cling closer together in the dark. So you lie there, staring into shadow, quilts pulled up to your chin. You count the creaks, the groans, the howls. You try to name each one, to tame it with explanation. That was just ice breaking on the river. That was just the stove cooling. That was just the rafter settling. Joke number 3. And if you can't name it, you decide it's probably Santa Claus arriving way too early. Eventually, fatigue wins. Your breathing sinks with the cabin's creaks. The dog settles again, and even the wolves quiet down. The strange orchestra of winter night carries you off to sleep, reminding you that out here, peace is never the absence of noise, it's the ability to rest despite it. When morning finally limps back into the world, the snow still heavy on the cabin roof, and the air biting at your nose, you're greeted by something rare, a flicker of joy. It isn't joy the way you know it now, with presents piled under a tree, music blasting from speakers, or malls dressed up in glittering lights. On the frontier, holidays came with little more than a shift in the ordinary grind, a chance to savor small luxuries and to pretend, for a short while, that winter wasn't winning. It might be Christmas, or perhaps New Year's, or even a saint's feast carried over from old world traditions. The cabin stirs differently. The porridge pot simmers, yes, but today, someone sneaks in a spoonful of molasses, transforming the gray mush into something that feels almost decadent. The children giggle, eyes wide at sweetness they rarely taste in December. Quirky tidbit. Some families carved sugar into lumps that were rationed like treasure, and children often kept one tucked in a pocket for weeks, licking it slowly until it disappeared. Presents? Don't expect ribbons or paper. A father might have whittled a small toy, a horse with stiff wooden legs, a doll stitched from rags, a top spun smooth by hours of sanding. A mother may have saved bright scraps of cloth for a hand-sewn cap, or perhaps knitted mittens. Joke number 1. Frontier Santa didn't need a sleigh, he needed a whittling knife and a strong thimble. Food, of course, carried the celebration. Dried apples, rehydrated into a pie, sweetened with the rare miracle of sugar if you had some. A chicken might be sacrificed for stew, its aroma drifting into every corner of the cabin. Bread was baked with extra care, maybe glazed with honey, golden and fragrant. Families pooled their meager luxuries, neighbors trudging through snow with a jar of preserves, a slab of cured meat, or simply a fiddle tucked under one arm. Historians still argue whether frontier holidays were solemn religious occasions or more about communal feasting, but most accounts suggest they were both, prayers at dawn, laughter, and dancing by evening. And dance there was. Chairs shoved back, floor swept clear, the fiddler tuning strings that had survived 3 winters too many. The bow screeches at first, then finds its voice. Feet stomp in rhythm, skirts swirl, boots pound, and suddenly the cramped, smoky cabin transforms into a hall. Children clap along, old men grin, and for a few hours you almost forget the cold pressing at the shutters. Joke number 2. Frontier Square dancing was less graceful twirls and more try not to step on your neighbor's toes while the floorboards creak in protest. The decorations were humble but heartfelt. Pine branches brought in from the woods, their scent filling the air. A candle placed carefully in the window, flickering a soft welcome to anyone trudging by. Some families hung strings of dried berries, apples, or even popped corn if they had the patience. Nothing was wasted. Everything became both ornament and snack. Children played simple games, blind man's bluff, riddles, or just chasing each other around until someone tripped over the dog. Adults told stories, legends of their homeland, tales of saints and kings, or memories of past winters when the cold seemed just as bitter, but somehow survivable. These stories weren't mere entertainment, they were inheritance, weaving identity into each listener. Historians debate whether these small holiday gatherings carried more weight psychologically than materially. Was it the pie or the song that gave families strength to endure? The evidence tilts toward the intangible. The way laughter lightened heavy hearts. The way children's wide eyes reminded parents why they endured. Quirky fact. Some settlers believed making noise at New Year's chased away evil spirits of the old year. So pots were banged, fiddles squealed, and neighbors shouted into the cold night, a ragged symphony of hope and superstition. Imagine that echoing across a snowbound valley, The wilderness briefly alive with human defiance. When the music fades, the candles gutter, and the food is gone, the cold is still there, waiting. The stove must be stoked, the water fetched, the animals tended. But something has shifted. The cabin smells of pine and pie, children doze with rag dolls clutched tight, and adults carry the faint smile of people who have remembered they are not only surviving, but living. Joke number 3, you fall asleep under your pile of quilts, full from too much stew, and dream of Christmases where the best gift is not socks or toys, but simply socks that don't have holes. You settle back at the table where last night's candle left a little lake of tallow, and you notice the quiet ballet of work that makes winter livable. A needle flashes in the lamplight, steady, patient, and a knife whispers against wood, shaving curls that fall like pale feathers. You thread a length of homespun through your fingers and take your place in the choreography. Mend, tighten, oil, stitch. The cabin is an engine of small repairs, each task a gear that turns the next, and everyone has a handle to crank. Sewing is not a hobby here, it's maintenance. Socks give up first. The heels blink open like sleepy mouths. And you, promoted to chief surgeon, darn, until you can no longer tell patch from original. The quilt on your knees holds the history of every shirt that ever gave up its last button. At the far end of the table, a hand carves a new haft for the hatchet, coaxing strength from a strip of hickory. Beside it, another palm rubs fat into leather boots, so they'll forgive another week of ice. Joke 1, your resume now reads, sock doctor and assistant axe orthopedist, which sounds ridiculous until you remember it's exactly correct. Division of labor exists, but it bends in the cold. The worn story says men chop, women cook. You learn the truer story is everyone does what the day demands. He stirs the pot when the baby howls, she shoulders the maul when the woodpile sulks. Children shuttle between tasks like busy sparrows, fetch more thread, sweep the shavings, hold the lantern higher. Historians still argue whether frontier winters flattened the old separate spheres or carved them deeper. Diaries tease both answers. You see a mother with chapped hands slinging a yoke of water buckets at dawn, and a father darning a mitten by dusk because the wind doesn't read rule books. There are shapes to the hours. After chores, the mending hour arrives like a tide. Thimbles click, thread knots. You keep a hussif, a little roll-up sewing kit, tucked in your pocket because a torn seam waits for no committee. That's the mainstream fact you can count on. Nearly every household kept a sewing kit close, and nearly every pair of hands knew the language of needles. A button saved is a day's comfort earned. You lean close to the lamp, inhale that familiar perfume of smoke and wool, and try not to scorch the thread the way you scorched your nightcap back in the lantern section. Quiet resilience shows in tiny economies. Bones from yesterday's stew become today's broth. The last smear of lard is scraped from the barrel with the seriousness of a bank withdrawal. The children's growth is measured not on a door jamb, but in hems let down and restitched. Quirky tidbit. For teething babies, some families knot a scrap of cloth into a sugar tit, dab it with molasses or honey, and let the little one gum it into peace. It's not exactly dental science, but it's sweeter than mustard plasters and goose grease, your recent aromatherapy combo. You glance around and see skill tucked into every corner. A woman's hand turns flax into thread with the rhythm of a metronome, then moves to a spinning wheel that hums like a contented bee. A man's knife makes a snowshoes cross-lacing, then a new latch for the door because the last gust tried to rewrite the hinge. Someone plats straw into a hat brim that will meet summer when summer remembers to come. Joke 2, if productivity apps existed, the cabin would delete them for being too slow. There are boundaries, yes, but they're edged with gentleness. She knows the cow's moods the way he knows the axe's. He reads the weather in the snow squeak at midnight. She reads the fever in a child's brow at dawn. You trade strengths without counting, and yet you also see exceptions that refuse to be exceptions. Widows run claims, hands raw on the plow handles, because the Homestead Act lets them sign their name and prove up the land like anyone else. Young men cook more than they expected and discover they care whether the cornbread is dry. Girls wrangle sledges, boys rock cradles. Historians still argue whether such crossings were temporary fixes or true shifts. The ledger of winter shows a column labeled whatever works, and it's always paid. You remember the neighbor's midnight knock and the way the room widened to receive them. That's part of it too. Women as midwives, calm as winter moons, men as runners, sure-footed on the creek ice at first light. The community breathes through the tasks assigned and the tasks adopted. A fiddle tune at a quilting bee is not leisure, it's fuel. A batch of soap boiled in the yard is not drudgery. It's a treaty with February that says, "We will meet you clean." Work carries stories. She stitches a little red square at the heart of a log cabin quilt block because someone taught her that a red center means home. He carves a fish on the haft of the draw knife because his father did, and because hands remember what minds forget. Children learn the catechism of care. Clean the lamp chimney, mind the kettle, never leave a candle to think for itself. Joke 3. If you put frontier intern on your imaginary business card, your job description is yes. Even rest wears purpose. You sit together in the drowsy hour, counting stitches and breaths. Someone reads in a soft voice about a far country. The wolf chorus is quieter tonight, or maybe your ears have chosen not to listen. You compare calluses like badges. Your mind floats to warmer days. The tick dragged into the sunshine, straw fluffed and replaced, the onion braids finally taken down one by one, their perfume less bossy than last month. The calf with the ridiculous knitted ear caps trotting after its mother like a dignified clown. The debates of scholars won't visit your table, but you live their questions without naming them. Did the frontier make roles harder or softer? Did the cold teach equality or endurance? Historians still argue whether power sat in the chair by the stove or at the woodpile outside. You decide it sits wherever someone keeps the fire, because everything else depends on that. You finish the last seam, bite the thread, and smooth the patch with your thumb. The new axe haft balances in a satisfied hand. Someone sets tomorrow's sourdough to rise near the banked coals, that quiet bowl of bubbles like a pet you all feed. You bank the fire, check the latch string, and listen for the cabin's contented snore. The work has not ended. It has only paused, and that pause is its own kind of victory. You slip a hand under the quilts, find the place where warmth has gathered, and tuck yourself there, not as a hero, not as a martyr, just as one more person in a chain of hands, keeping a small light alive against a very large night. You wake to another day and discover, as always, that winter rewards creativity. Yesterday's chores might keep you alive, but it's ingenuity that makes life bearable. Every corner of the cabin brims with little experiments, some clever, some comical, and some that historians still argue about when they stumble across them in diaries. Out here, invention isn't a luxury, it's as necessary as firewood. Take snowshoes for example. You've already trudged through drifts up to your waist, boots filling with icy powder, and decided enough is enough. The frontier solution? Frames bent from green wood, laced with rawhide thongs. They look more like tennis rackets than footwear, but strap them on, and suddenly you're gliding on top of the snow instead of drowning in it. Quirky tidbit. Settlers borrowed this brilliant design from native peoples who had perfected the art long before Europeans ever thought to stomp into the wilderness. Joke number 1. Congratulations, you've invented the world's slowest skis. At least you won't faceplant quite as often. Inside the cabin, the tinkering continues. Someone has built a sled from barrel staves, lashed together with rope, because hauling water and firewood by hand is a slow form of torture. Others fashion harnesses from worn leather belts, turning children into reluctant draft animals for dragging loads across ice. Was it dignified? Not at all. Was it effective? Absolutely. Historians still debate whether these homemade contraptions save more energy than they wasted, but one thing is certain. Necessity pushed everyone into the role of inventor. Then there's the matter of heat. We've talked about stoves and bricks, but families didn't stop there. Some sewed sleeping bags by stitching quilts into long sacks you could crawl inside like a cocoon. Others experimented with lining walls and newspaper, cheap insulation that also gave you something to read when boredom clawed. Quirky fact, archaeologists have found remnants of wallpaper made from old newspapers in frontier homes. The faded headlines, still legible under layers of paste. Joke number 2, Interior design meets tomorrow's recycling program, Frontier Edition. Food storage inspired its own oddities. When root cellars weren't enough, people tried suspending food in wells, lowering barrels into the icy depths to keep meat cool. Others packed snow into crates to preserve butter or milk, essentially inventing primitive refrigerators. Some went a step further and experimented with frozen milk cakes, which could be shaved into porridge months later. Historians aren't sure how appetizing that really was, but at least it stretched supplies. Children, too, invented. Bored with long nights, they twisted straw into makeshift dolls, carved sticks into whistles, or built tiny sledges for mice. One journal mentions a boy who rigged up a windmill from an old wagon wheel and scraps of cloth, convinced he could grind corn with it. Spoiler, he couldn't. But the spirit of invention, the hope that cleverness could bend the world, never left. Some inventions lean toward the eccentric. There are accounts of settlers strapping hot potatoes to their wrists as hand warmers. Others describe foot ovens, little tin boxes filled with coals and tucked under blankets, or wagon benches. Quirky tidbit. One family even experimented with stuffing chicken feathers into sacks as insulation, discovering they worked wonderfully until the first draft scattered them across the cabin like snow. Joke number 3, nothing says cozy evening like a blizzard of chicken feathers indoors. Of course, not every invention succeeded. Some failed spectacularly. A homemade sled that broke apart mid-hill, a snowshoe frame that snapped under weight, dumping the wearer head first into a drift, a makeshift lantern fashioned from a bottle that exploded when the flame got too eager. Failure wasn't shameful, it was expected. The frontier taught you to laugh, patch up the mess, and try again tomorrow. Historians still argue whether these small experiments count as true technology or just improvisation, but the line between them is thin. The log cabins, the quilts, the snowshoes, even the strange insulated sacks, all were seeds of invention, proof that survival bred creativity as naturally as necessity bred blisters. You sit back now, watching the smoke curl from your patched stove, and consider how every odd device in the room tells a story. The bent sled in the corner, the feather-stuffed pillow, the 2 big snowshoes leaning against the wall. Each is a reminder that your family is not simply surviving, but adapting, reshaping the wilderness with scraps and stubbornness. And if you squint at it the right way, you see not just hardship, but a kind of humor. A family bundled in 3 quilts each, stomping around on mismatched snowshoes, hauling water with a sled that looks more like a toy than a tool. It's almost comical. Almost. Until the wind rattles the shutters again, and you realize these odd inventions, however clumsy, are the only thing standing between you and the cold. The snow begins to soften, not vanish, not yet, but it slumps and slouches like a tired guest who finally admits it can't stay forever. The hard crust you've been walking on for months turns to slush under your boots, and every step sends icy water squishing up your socks. The air, though, carries a hint of change, something damp, earthy, alive. For the first time in months, you can smell soil again, and it smells like possibility. Spring thaw is not a gentle arrival, it's a messy siege. The roof drips steadily, plunk, 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 filling buckets you set beneath the leaks. The yard turns into a soup of mud and melting snow. Children stomp through it gleefully, coming back inside looking like they've wrestled a swamp. Joke number 1. Frontier Laundry Day was already a nightmare. Spring thaw made it look like a punishment invented by your worst enemy. The river breaks first. Ice that seemed immovable just yesterday begins to groan and fracture. Great slabs shift, grinding against each other with the roar of 1,000 wagons. Families gather on the bank to watch, equal parts awe and terror in their eyes. Quirky tidbit. Some settlers swore the ice carried away bad luck with it, as though the river were tidying up after winter's long visit. Whether or not that's true, it certainly carried away more than one carelessly placed fence post or abandoned sled. Cabins shed their winter coats too. Snow slides from roofs in heavy sheets, crashing to the ground with enough force to shake the walls. The mud beneath your door freezes at night and turns to slop by noon, forcing you to scrape boots every time you come inside. Historians still argue whether spring was more of a blessing or a curse. Yes, it ended the cold, but it also brought floods, sickness, and endless mud. One diary even calls it the cruelest season, though written in a hand clearly relieved to have survived January. Animals perk up first. Cows bawl louder, eager for grass that has yet to appear. Horses stamp in the corral, restless after months in the barn. Chickens peck at the thawing ground as though they alone could coax worms back to life. You shovel muck, repair fences, and dream of green shoots pushing through soggy fields. Food supplies by now are dwindling. The barrels are nearly empty, the apples shriveled into wrinkled ghosts of themselves, the beans rationed so carefully that you can count them out like coins. You feel a hunger not just for food, but for freshness. A bite of onion pulled straight from the earth, a leaf of lettuce, a berry plucked sunworm from a bush. That craving gnaws at you as surely as any hunger. Joke number 2. If someone handed you a salad right now, you'd treat it like a birthday cake. The thaw also exposes what winter tried to hide. Broken tools buried in drifts. A boot lost 3 months ago. The remains of snow forts built and abandoned. And sometimes, less amusingly, the carcass of an animal that didn't make it through. Spring cleans up with brutal honesty, leaving no secret unturned. But alongside the mess comes relief. You step outside one morning and hear birdsong, a thin, tentative trill that makes your chest ache with joy. The sky looks bluer, the air softer. Children run without mittens, daring the chill, their laughter echoing. Neighbors emerge from cabins you half suspected had frozen into monuments. Suddenly the valley is alive again, voices and footsteps threading across the muck. Communities mark the thaw with work bees. Fences must be raised, fields plowed, roads cleared of debris. Men and women shoulder tools side by side, children trailing behind with baskets of stones. The labor is exhausting, but the air buzzes with energy. Historians still argue whether this burst of cooperation was born from joy or necessity. The truth is likely both. After months of isolation, even hauling logs feels festive when done together. Quirky fact: many families use the first warm days to beat their mattresses, hauling straw ticks into the yard and walloping them with sticks. Dust billowed, straw shifted, and neighbors traded jokes across the fence. A strangely communal ritual, equal parts cleaning and celebration. Joke number 3. Frontier spring cleaning was less about sparkling windows and more about not sleeping on 6 months of crumbs and mouse droppings. At night, the air still bites, but softer now, more like a warning than a threat. You crawl under quilts that seem lighter, not because they've changed, but because you have. Your body remembers the deep freeze, and this feels merciful by comparison. Sleep comes easier. Dreams lean toward planting, green fields, rivers running free. The frontier winter has not been kind. It never is. But as the last of the ice slops away, you realize you've done it. You've seen the coldest nights, endured the darkest hours, and now you stand at the edge of something new. Spring isn't a guarantee of ease. It brings its own battles. But it is a promise. A promise that the world, however stubborn, always remembers how to begin again. The thaw continues, and with it your body begins to let go of a season's worth of tension. The nights are still cool, but they feel kinder, gentler. The cabin no longer groans like a ship in an icebound sea. It exhales, quietly, as if relieved right along with you. The stove no longer needs such fierce attention, and the water at the well comes more easily, without that sharp crack of breaking ice. Life is still hard, but the edges soften. You sit by the door in the fading light, listening to the steady drip of snowmelt, the liquid rhythm tapping against the earth. A bird calls faintly, a fragile song that feels like a gift after months of silence. The air carries the faint scent of mud, of damp wood, of promise. You close your eyes and let it linger, slow and heavy, until it feels as though the season itself is wrapping you in its arms. And in that moment, the memories of cold nights, smoky stoves, and drafty quilts ease into the background. They are still there, but distant, like the echo of wolves on a winter night, fading into the hills. What remains is the warmth of a family huddled together, the the comfort of neighbors knocking at midnight with help in hand, and the quiet resilience that carried you through. As you lie back, the quilt's a little lighter on your shoulders, your breath slows. The sounds blur into one another. The drip of thawing snow, the crackle of an ember, the faint hum of your own heart. The frontier no longer feels sharp or hostile. It feels drowsy, ready for rest. Let your eyes close. Let the last threads of winter loosen. Sleep now as the frontier sleeps, quietly, steadily, beneath the promise of spring.